Picture this. It's a cold, rainy Tuesday evening in November. The kind of night where the wind cuts through your jacket and the street lights blur into halos through the mist. In the small town of Millbrook, population 12,000, most folks are settling in for the night. But one man is about to experience an encounter that will change everything he thought he knew about respect, dignity, and the power of assumptions. The Chevron gas station on Highway 9 sits like a beacon in the darkness, its fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the wet pavement. A black Mercedes sedan pulls up to pump number 3, its engine purring softly before falling silent. The driver steps out, a tall, distinguished black man in his early 60s, wearing a simple gray hoodie and jeans. To any casual observer, he might look like just another traveler stopping for gas on his way through town. But appearances, as we're about to discover, can be devastatingly deceiving. The man moves with quiet confidence as he begins fueling his car. There's something about his posture, the way he carries himself, that speaks of authority and wisdom earned through decades of experience. His hands, though gentle, bear the subtle marks of someone who has worked tirelessly to build something meaningful. His eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, hold the depth of someone who has seen both the worst and best of humanity. As he stands there in the cold drizzle, pumping gas and checking his phone for directions, he has no idea that in just a few minutes, his evening will take a turn that will serve as a powerful reminder of why we must never judge a book by its cover. A police cruiser turns into the gas station, its headlights sweeping across the lot. The officer inside takes notice of the Mercedes and its driver. In a split second, that dangerous moment when prejudice masquerades as instinct. Assumptions are made, judgments are formed, and a scene is set that will reveal the true character of everyone involved. What happens next will shock you. But more importantly, it will challenge you to examine your own heart and ask yourself a crucial question. How often do we let what we see on the surface blind us to the truth of who someone really is? Justice Marcus Washington hadn't always worn the robes of the Supreme Court. Born in 1962 in a tiny apartment above his grandmother's bakery in Birmingham, Alabama, he learned early that respect wasn't something you inherited, it was something you earned, one decision at a time. His mother, Sarah Washington, worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table after his father died in a construction accident when Marcus was just 8 years old. She cleaned offices before dawn, served lunch at the elementary school cafeteria, and stocked shelves at the local grocery store until late at night. Despite her exhaustion, she never failed to check his homework or ask about his day. "Marcus," she would say, her hands cracked from cleaning chemicals but still gentle as she helped him with his studies. "Education is the one thing nobody can ever take away from you. Promise me you'll remember that." He promised, and he kept that promise, through everything that followed. Marcus excelled in school despite the odds stacked against him. While other kids spent summers playing baseball or swimming at the community pool, he worked alongside his mother, learning the value of hard work and the dignity that comes from honest labor. He saw how people sometimes looked at her and at him with pity or dismissal, and he made a silent vow that one day he would prove that circumstances don't define destiny. The scholarship to Harvard Law School felt like a miracle, but it was really the result of years of 4 a.m. study sessions and a mother who believed her son could change the world. Law school brought new challenges. He was often the only black student in his classes, facing subtle and sometimes not so subtle discrimination from both peers and professors. But Marcus had learned something powerful from his mother. Dignity isn't determined by how others treat you, it's determined by how you choose to respond. After graduating summa cum laude, he could have taken any high-paying position at a top law firm. Instead, he returned to Alabama to work as a public defender, representing people who couldn't afford fancy lawyers, but deserved justice just the same. For 15 years, he fought for the forgotten, the overlooked, the dismissed. His reputation grew, not just for his legal brilliance, but for his character. He treated everyone, from janitors to judges, with the same level of respect. When he was appointed to the federal bench at age 42, and later to the Supreme Court at 58, colleagues noted that success had never changed him. He still remembered where he came from. Which brings us back to that gas station in Millbrook, where Justice Washington, though no one there knew who he was about to face a test that would reveal the character of everyone involved. Millbrook prided itself on being a quiet, peaceful community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Located 40 miles outside the state capital, it was the kind of place where Friday night football games drew the whole town, where the diner on Main Street had served the same menu for 30 years, and where change came slowly, if at all. Officer Bradley Thompson had been patrolling these streets for 8 years. At 34, he was the kind of cop who knew every shortcut, every troublemaker, and every family's history going back 3 generations. He'd grown up here, played quarterback for the Millbrook Mustangs, and married his high school sweetheart right after graduation. Brad wasn't a bad man, but he was a product of his environment, one where diversity was more of a concept you heard about on the news than a daily reality. In Millbrook's population of 12,000, less than 6% were minorities, and most of those lived in the older part of town near the railroad tracks. He'd never had to examine his assumptions about people who looked different from him, because he rarely encountered them in contexts that challenged his preconceptions. When he did see unfamiliar faces, especially black men driving expensive cars, his training kicked in. But so did something else. The subtle biases that he'd never been forced to confront. That Tuesday evening, Brad was finishing what had been a routine shift. He'd responded to a fender bender, written 2 speeding tickets, and helped Mrs. Henderson when her car wouldn't start in the Walmart parking lot. As he drove past the Chevron station, his attention was drawn to the black Mercedes at Pump 3. The car was clean, expensive, and had out-of-state plates. The man standing beside it didn't fit Brad's mental image of who belonged behind the wheel of such a vehicle. In that instant, before he even realized what was happening, assumptions began forming in his mind. Maybe the car was stolen. Maybe this was someone up to no good. Maybe this was exactly the kind of situation his sergeant had warned them about during roll call. Keep your eyes open for anything that doesn't look right. Brad turned into the gas station, telling himself he was just being cautious, just doing his job. But deep down, in the part of his mind he didn't like to examine too closely, other thoughts were stirring. Thoughts shaped by years of unchallenged assumptions about who belonged where and who deserved respect. He had no idea that the man pumping gas 30 feet away had spent his career defending the very principles of justice and equality that Brad had sworn to uphold. He couldn't have imagined that this quiet, unassuming figure had argued cases before the highest court in the land, or that his legal opinions had shaped the law that governed them all. All Brad saw was what he expected to see, and that limited vision was about to lead to a confrontation that would change his life forever. "Evening," Officer Thompson called out as he approached the Mercedes, his hand instinctively resting on his service weapon. "Everything all right here?" Justice Washington looked up from the gas pump, noting the officer's tense posture and the suspicious tone in his voice. He'd been in situations like this before, more times than he cared to count, and he'd learned that staying calm was always the best approach. "Good evening, officer," he replied, his voice steady and respectful. "Yes, everything's fine, just getting some gas for the road." "This your car?" Brad asked, stepping closer, his flashlight beam sweeping over the vehicle's interior. "Yes, it is. Mind if I see some ID and registration?" Justice Washington paused for just a moment. He wasn't speeding, wasn't breaking any laws, wasn't doing anything except putting gas in his own car. But he also understood the delicate dynamics at play. He'd seen too many encounters like this escalate unnecessarily, often with tragic consequences. "Of course," he said calmly, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket for his wallet. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Brad barked, suddenly on high alert. "I'm just getting my identification, officer. My movements are slow and deliberate, as you can see." Brad's radio crackled. "Unit 47. What's your status?" "I'm at the Chevron on Highway 9, doing a routine check," Brad responded, never taking his eyes off Justice Washington. As the justice handed over his driver's license, Brad studied it with his flashlight. The address was from out of state, the car was expensive, and something about the situation still felt off to him. "What brings you to Millbrook, boy?" The word hung in the air like a slap. Justice Washington felt the familiar sting, not of surprise, because he'd heard that word used that way too many times in his 62 years, but of disappointment. Here was a young man, probably educated, sworn to protect and serve, still using language that reduced a grown man to something less than human. "I'm traveling through on my way to a conference," he replied, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel that anyone paying attention would have noticed. "What kind of conference?" Brad pressed, his suspicion growing. "What kind of work you in?" "I work in government." "Government? Haha." Brad's laugh was mocking. "What, like you work at the DMV or something?" Two more police cruisers pulled into the gas station, their red and blue lights painting the rainy night in alternating colors. Word had gotten out that Brad might need backup, though for what, no one was quite sure. Officers Martinez and Johnson approached, hands on their weapons, creating a semicircle around Justice Washington, who stood with quiet dignity beside his car, the gas pump still in his hand. "What's the situation?" Martinez asked. "Got a suspicious person here," Brad replied. "Expensive car, out-of-state plates, vague answers about what he's doing in town." Justice Washington looked at the three officers surrounding him, noting their aggressive postures, their assumptions, their complete inability to see him as anything other than a threat to be neutralized. He thought about his mother, about the lessons she'd taught him, about maintaining dignity in the face of humiliation. He thought about the thousands of cases he'd reviewed, the constitutional principles he'd spent his life defending, the very laws these officers were sworn to uphold. He thought about the irony of the moment, how the man they were treating as a criminal was actually one of the most powerful protectors of their rights and freedoms. "Officers," he said quietly, "I'm happy to cooperate, but I believe this stops here. I haven't committed any crime, I'm not acting suspiciously, and I've answered your questions. I'm going to finish putting gas in my car and continue on my way." "You'll do what we tell you to do, boy," Brad snapped, stepping closer. "And right now, I'm telling you to put your hands on the hood of the car." That word again, boy. Justice Washington had heard it from segregationists in Alabama, from opposing counsel trying to rattle him in court, from people who saw his skin color and assumed they knew everything they needed to know about him. He'd learned to let it roll off his back, to channel his anger into determination, to prove with his actions what words could never convey. But tonight, something was different. Maybe it was the accumulation of a lifetime of such encounters. Maybe it was the exhaustion of constantly having to prove his worth. Maybe it was the realization that even at the pinnacle of professional success, he could still be reduced to a stereotype in the eyes of someone who'd never bothered to look beyond the surface. Whatever it was, Justice Washington made a decision that would change everything. "He's gone." He began to remove his gray hoodie. "What are you doing?" Officer Martinez demanded, his hand moving to his weapon. "I'm removing my jacket," Justice Washington said calmly, his movements slow and deliberate. "I want to show you something." Underneath the casual hoodie was a crisp white dress shirt, perfectly pressed despite the long day of travel. And underneath that, barely visible at the collar, was something that made Officer Johnson take a step back in confusion. Justice Washington continued undressing, removing the white shirt to reveal what lay beneath. The formal judicial robes of a Supreme Court justice, worn for a speaking engagement earlier that day and never changed out of in his hurry to get back on the road. The gas station fell silent except for the steady patter of rain on the concrete canopy above. The three officers stared in stunned disbelief at the man they'd been treating like a criminal suspect. The black robes, unmistakable in their significance, seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights. The gold embroidery, the perfect tailoring, the weight of centuries of judicial tradition. It was all there, worn by a man they'd called boy just moments before. "My name," Justice Washington said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in the highest halls of power, "is Justice Marcus Washington. I serve on the Supreme Court of the United States. I was traveling through your town on my way to speak at a judicial conference about civil rights and equal justice under the law." Officer Thompson's face went white. The blood drained from his cheeks as the full magnitude of what had just happened hit him like a physical blow. His hands began to shake. I didn't," he stammered, unable to form complete sentences. "You didn't know," Justice Washington finished for him. "And that's exactly the point." The justice looked at each of the three officers, his gaze steady and penetrating. There was no anger in his eyes, no desire for revenge or humiliation. Instead, there was something far more powerful, disappointment mixed with hope, the look of a teacher who recognizes a teachable moment. "Tell me, Officer Thompson," he said, reading the nameplate on Brad's uniform, "when you saw me tonight, what did you see?" Brad couldn't answer. His throat felt constricted, his mouth dry. Everything he thought he knew about the situation, about himself, about the assumptions he made every day, was crumbling around him. "I'll tell you what you saw," Justice Washington continued. "You saw a black man in casual clothes driving an expensive car, and you made a judgment. You decided that something didn't fit, that I didn't belong, that I must be up to no good. You called me boy, a word designed to diminish, to reduce a grown man to something less than human." Officer Martinez had removed his hat and was staring at the ground. Officer Johnson was backing away slowly, as if trying to distance himself from the situation. "But here's what you didn't see," the justice continued, his voice growing stronger. "You didn't see a man who grew up in poverty but refused to let circumstances define him. You didn't see someone who worked 3 jobs to get through college, who graduated at the top of his law school class, who spent 15 years defending people who couldn't defend themselves. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming on the metal canopy above them, but none of the men moved. You didn't see a federal judge or a Supreme Court justice, or someone who has spent his entire career fighting for the very rights and freedoms you've sworn to protect. All you saw was what you expected to see, what your assumptions told you to see." Justice Washington began putting his white shirt back on, his movements calm and deliberate. "The question is," he said, looking directly at Officer Thompson, "what are you going to do with this moment? How are you going to let this change you?" Officer Thompson felt as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about his judgment, about his ability to read people and situations had been shattered in an instant. The man he'd treated with suspicion and disrespect, the man he'd called boy, was one of the most powerful and respected figures in American law. The silence stretched on, broken only by the steady rhythm of rain and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. Other customers at the gas station had begun to notice the commotion, some pulling out their phones to record what was happening. "Justice Washington," Brad finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say." The justice finished buttoning his shirt and looked at the young officer with something that surprised everyone present, including himself. Compassion. "Officer Thompson, how old are you?" 34, sir." "I'm 62. When I was your age I made assumptions too. We all do. The difference is what we do when those assumptions are challenged, when we're forced to confront the fact that we might be wrong." Just as Washington walked slowly toward his car, the other officers parting to make way. But instead of getting in and driving away, he leaned against the hood and continued speaking. "Let me tell you about a night in 1995, he said. "I was a federal judge then, driving home from a late dinner meeting in Montgomery. I was pulled over by a state trooper who was convinced I'd stolen the car I was driving. He had me on the ground, hands cuffed behind my back, for 20 minutes before backup arrived and sorted things out. Officer Martinez looked up, surprise evident on his face. The trooper was embarrassed, apologetic, full of excuses, but you know what the real tragedy was? He learned nothing from that experience. 6 months later, I heard he'd done the same thing to another black professional. The assumptions never changed. Justice Washington straightened up and looked directly at each officer. I'm not telling you that story to shame you or to make you feel worse than you already do. I'm telling you because you have a choice to make right now. You can let this moment pass, tell yourself it was just a misunderstanding, go back to business as usual, or you can let it transform you. The gas pump clicked off, startling everyone. Justice Washington had been so focused on the encounter that he'd forgotten he was still fueling his car. "Sir," Officer Johnson spoke up for the first time, his voice shaky. What can we do? How do we make this right?" Justice Washington smiled, the first time his expression had softened since the encounter began. "You make it right by remembering this moment every time you put on that uniform. You make it right by questioning your assumptions, by treating every person you encounter with the respect and dignity they deserve, regardless of what they look like or what kind of car they drive." He walked around to the driver's side of his Mercedes but paused before getting in. "You make it right by understanding that respect isn't something you give to people based on their title or position. Respect is something you give to people because they're human beings, because they have inherent worth and dignity." Officer Thompson stepped forward, his voice stronger now but still filled with remorse. "Justice Washington, I need you to know, what happened here tonight, it's not who I want to be. It's not who I thought I was." The justice studied the young officer's face, seeing genuine remorse and, more importantly, a willingness to grow. "Officer Thompson, the fact that you can say that, the fact that this matters to you, tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. Good people make mistakes. Great people learn from them." As word of the encounter spread through Millbrook over the following days, it sparked conversations that the small town had never had before. The story made local news, then regional, then national, but Justice Washington, true to his character, declined most interview requests. This wasn't about publicity or making anyone look bad. It was about learning and growing. Officer Thompson requested a meeting with his supervisor the next morning. He asked to be enrolled in cultural sensitivity training, diversity awareness programs, anything that could help him become a better officer and a better person. His colleagues, Martinez and Johnson, requested the same training. "I thought I was a good cop," Brad confided to his wife that night, still shaken by the encounter. "I thought I was treating people fairly. But I realized I was looking at the world through such a narrow lens that I couldn't see what was right in front of me." The Millbrook Police Department, rather than trying to cover up the incident, used it as a teaching moment. Chief Reynolds organized a series of community meetings where residents could discuss their own assumptions and biases, where they could learn from each other's experiences. Justice Washington, when he learned about these efforts, agreed to return to Millbrook 3 months later to speak at one of these community meetings. The high school gymnasium was packed with more than 800 people, the largest gathering in the town's history. "I didn't come here tonight to lecture you," he told the assembled crowd. "I came because what happened at that gas station could have happened anywhere, to anyone. The real question is, what are we going to do about it?" He spoke about his childhood, about his mother's wisdom, about the long journey from poverty to the Supreme Court. But mostly he spoke about the power of second chances and the importance of seeing people as individuals, rather than as representatives of whatever group we think they belong to. Officer Thompson was in the front row, and when Justice Washington finished speaking, he stood up to address the crowd. 3 months ago, I made assumptions about a man based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the clothes he was wearing," Brad said, his voice clear and strong. "I treated him with disrespect and suspicion when I should have treated him with courtesy and professionalism. I called him a name that no human being should ever be called. The gymnasium was silent. Justice Washington could have ended my career that night. He could have filed complaints, demanded my termination, made sure I never worked in law enforcement again. Instead, he gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me, the chance to be better. Brad looked directly at Justice Washington. Sir, I want to thank you, not just for your forgiveness, but for showing me that dignity and respect aren't about titles or positions. They're about recognizing the humanity in every person we encounter. The standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes. In the months that followed, the story of Justice Washington and Officer Thompson became more than just a local news item. It became a catalyst for change. Police departments across the country began using their encounter as a training tool, helping officers examine their own biases and assumptions. Justice Washington, meanwhile, incorporated the experience into his judicial philosophy. In a major civil rights case that came before the Supreme Court 6 months later, he wrote in his opinion, "The presumption of dignity is not a legal concept, it is a human imperative. When we judge people based on appearance rather than character, when we make assumptions about worth based on wealth or status, when we reduce human beings to stereotypes and categories, we undermine the very foundations of justice and equality that our Constitution seeks to protect." Officer Thompson became one of the most respected members of the Millbrook Police Department. His approach to community policing, shaped by that night at the gas station, became a model for other small-town departments. He never forgot the lesson he learned about the danger of assumptions. Years later, when Brad was promoted to sergeant, he instituted a new practice. Every new officer was required to spend their first week on patrol with community members from different backgrounds, learning about their experiences and perspectives before they were allowed to make a single traffic stop. "You can't protect and serve people you don't understand," he would tell new recruits. "And you can't understand people if you've already decided who they are before you meet them." The gas station where it all happened became an unlikely landmark. The owner, inspired by the story, installed a small plaque near pump number 3. It read simply, "Dignity and respect for all, no exceptions." Justice Washington continued to serve on the Supreme Court with the same quiet dignity he'd always shown. But those who knew him well said that something had changed after that night in Millbrook. His already deep commitment to civil rights and human dignity seemed to burn even brighter. In his chambers, on the wall behind his desk, he kept a photo from that community meeting in Millbrook. Hundreds of faces, black and white, young and old, all united in a commitment to see each other more clearly, to judge less harshly, to offer grace more freely. As we reach the end of this incredible story, it's worth pausing to consider the profound lessons embedded in that rainy Tuesday evening at a small-town gas station. Justice Marcus Washington could have handled that encounter very differently. He could have immediately identified himself, used his position to embarrass the officers, or demanded consequences for their behavior. Instead, he chose a different path. He chose to turn a moment of humiliation into a moment of education, a confrontation into a conversation, an ending into a beginning. Officer Thompson could have responded differently too. When faced with the magnitude of his mistake, he could have become defensive, made excuses, or simply tried to forget the whole thing happened. Instead, he chose growth over comfort, learning over pride, transformation over justification. Their encounter reminds us of several powerful truths. First, that our assumptions about people based on their appearance, their clothes, their car, or their circumstances are often wrong, and sometimes devastatingly so. The man you dismiss as unimportant might be the most important person you'll ever meet. The person you treat with disrespect might be someone whose respect you desperately need. Second, that dignity is not something we earn through achievement or lose through circumstances. It's something we possess simply by virtue of being human. Justice Washington's dignity wasn't diminished by being called boy or treated like a criminal. It was revealed by how he chose to respond. Third, that the most powerful transformations often come not from punishment or public shaming, but from grace and second chances. Justice Washington's decision to treat Officer Thompson with compassion rather than contempt created space for genuine change to occur. Fourth, that we all carry biases and assumptions that we may not even recognize. The key is not to deny them, but to acknowledge them, examine them, and choose to do better. Officer Thompson's willingness to confront his own prejudices and seek training to overcome them turned a career-ending mistake into a career-defining moment. Finally, that individual encounters can have ripple effects far beyond what we imagine. That night at the gas station didn't just change two men. It changed a community, influenced a police department's training programs, and provided a powerful example for people across the country. Justice Washington later reflected that some of his most important work happened not in the marble halls of the Supreme Court, but in a gas station parking lot in a small town most people had never heard of. "The law matters," he said in a later speech. "Legal precedents matter. Constitutional principles matter. But ultimately, justice comes down to how we treat each other in the everyday moments when we think no one important is watching." That night in Millbrook, everyone was important, and everyone was watching, including themselves. To choose. The story of Justice Washington and Officer Thompson challenges each of us to examine our own hearts and habits. How often do we make snap judgments about people based on limited information? How frequently do our assumptions prevent us from seeing the full humanity of the person in front of us? Maybe you've never called someone boy in the way Officer Thompson did, but have you ever made assumptions about someone's intelligence based on their accent, their worth based on their job, their character based on their appearance? Have you ever been on the receiving end of such assumptions? How did it feel? What did you learn about yourself and about others? The beautiful thing about this story is that it doesn't end with the events in Millbrook. It continues every time someone chooses to see past surface appearances to the person beneath. It continues every time someone chooses grace over grudges, understanding over assumptions, dignity over dismissal. It continues with you. The next time you encounter someone who doesn't fit your expectations, who challenges your assumptions, who seems out of place in your world, remember Justice Washington and Officer Thompson. Remember that the person standing in front of you has a story, a history, a worth that transcends whatever superficial judgment you might make. Remember that dignity and respect aren't gifts we give to people who earn them. They're rights we acknowledge in people because they possess them. Remember that every encounter is an opportunity to build bridges rather than walls, to see clearly rather than through the fog of our preconceptions. Most importantly, remember that we all have the power to choose how we treat others, regardless of how others treat us. We can choose to perpetuate cycles of disrespect and assumption, or we can choose to break those cycles with acts of grace and recognition. Justice Washington chose grace. Officer Thompson chose growth. The community of Millbrook chose change. What will you choose? If this story has moved you, if it's challenged you to think differently about the assumptions you make and the respect you show, then share it. Talk about it with your friends and family. Use it as a starting point for conversations about dignity, respect, and the power of seeing people clearly. Hit that like button if you believe that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. Leave a comment sharing your own experiences with assumptions, either making them or being on the receiving end of them. And subscribe to join a community of people committed to seeing past surfaces to the humanity beneath. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Our shared humanity and our shared responsibility to honor it in everyone we meet. Remember, you never know when the person you're talking to might be someone whose respect and recognition could change your life forever. More importantly, you never know when your respect and recognition might change theirs. Officer called him boy until the Supreme Court judge took off his coat. But the real transformation didn't happen when the robe was revealed. It happened when two human beings chose to see each other clearly, to treat each other with dignity, and to let a moment of confrontation become a catalyst for growth. That transformation is available to all of us in every encounter, every day. The question is, will you take off your coat too?